Today we will reflect on the life of Martin Luther King as told by David Levering Lewis in his classic Biography. Martin Luther King sincerely sought to follow Mahatma Gandhi's example by staging nonviolent protests, even when provoked. Many local jurisdictions in the South made protesting illegal, and often hundreds of protesters were arrested. Several times the civil rights organizations petitioned the federal courts to overrule localities trying to stifle protests, which the Bill of Rights protects under the freedom of assembly. Unfortunately, as militants became more influential, violent protests and even riots erupted in many cities, souring many whites on the civil rights struggle. What struck me is how violently the KKK and the white supremacists opposed civil rights and voting rights for blacks. Twice King family houses were bombed. Dozens of black homes and churches were bombed. Once during Sunday school, many blacks were murdered, and many were beaten both by police and protesters. The civil rights era was near the dawn of the television age. What distinguished Martin Luther King from prior generations of black leaders is that he's the first celebrity civil rights leader. Now when Southern sheriffs sicked their dogs and drew their clubs on protesters, everyone in America could see the blood and watch the violence in real time on their living room television sets. And Martin Luther King was also a spellbinding orator. He was great television. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare, which includes illustrations. Our sister blog includes footnotes, and both include our Amazon book links. Martin Luther King was born in Atlanta, a city that had a large black professional class, which included ministers like his father and grandfather. His family was known for their involvement with civil rights. His maternal grandfather was one of the charter members of the local NAACP chapter and advocated building Booker T. Washington High School, the first black secondary school in Atlanta. Unlike other smaller southern cities, there was a sizable black professional class in Atlanta, including professors, businessmen, insurance executives, and professionals like doctors and dentists and morticians. Like W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin discovered that his white playmates distanced themselves from him once they started advancing in school. The parents of two of his white playmates forbid them to associate with him when they were old enough to attend elementary school. His mother cautioned him, "Don't make this feel that you are not as good as white people. You are as good as anyone else, and don't you forget it." As a young minister graduating from a prestigious seminary, Martin Luther King was honored by his calling to be minister of the renowned Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, a prestigious colored church in Atlanta, Georgia, in early 1954. But in December 1955, during the busy Christmas season, after a long day at work, during some nasty weather, a courageous, courteous, and unassuming black lady broke both the law and Southern etiquette by refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger and moved to the back of the bus. The police were called, and they arrested Mrs. Rosa Parks. In response, the local NAACP chapter and local black ministers organized the Montgomery bus boycott that lasted over a year. They selected Martin Luther King to lead the boycott, and carpools were organized to ferry black workers to their jobs. Why did this bus boycott succeed when so many past protests had been futile? Martin Luther King was a great orator. He was great television. But the other key factor that enabled the civil rights protests to succeed was the Supreme Court decision in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, which desegregated the schools, signaling the court's willingness to advance civil rights causes. Federal judges, affirmed by the Supreme Court, ruled that buses could no longer be segregated. But in response to the desegregation of the buses, violence erupted. A black teenage girl was beaten. A pregnant woman was shot. Homes and churches were dynamited, and 4 black Baptist churches were destroyed. But 5 white men were found guilty of these bombings by a white jury, which was one of the first times that whites were found guilty of grave crimes against blacks by white juries in the Deep South. After the successes and struggles in the Montgomery bus boycott, a regional conference formed the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Martin Luther King was elected president, and the Reverend Ralph Abernathy was elected treasurer. Now, in that era, blacks were not permitted to eat lunch with white customers at lunch counters at department and variety stores. In 1960, college students, black and white, protested in North Carolina by sitting at lunch counters, and if they were not served, they would simply stay to protest. These sit-ins spread to Atlanta and 13 other cities in 5 states across the Deep South. To organize a student protest movement nationally, the SCLC provided the initial funding to found the independent SNCC, or SNCC, or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the future Congressman John Lewis was selected to be the leader of SNCC. SNCC issued a student manifesto, an appeal for human rights, that demanded community action in education, housing, jobs, voting, law enforcement, hospitals, and entertainment facilities, including restaurants, movies, and concerts. Now, in 1961, freedom rides were organized where black and white students and activists rode interstate buses to challenge segregation. Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and the SCLC participated in the protests. The first 2 buses carrying the black and white protesters, or freedom riders, boarded in Washington, D.C., bound for Alabama. One bus was set on fire by angry whites. When the other bus reached Birmingham, Alabama, the freedom riders were beaten severely by white thugs while Bull Connor and the police looked on, and while the television cameras rolled. When another group of freedom riders departing from Tennessee arrived in Montgomery, Alabama, they were initially threatened by a mob of 300 angry whites, which swelled to nearly 1,000. John Lewis of SNCC, a future congressman, a leading journalist, and a special White House representative were among those injured in the ensuing violence. While the mobs rioted, the television cameras continued to roll, and public opinion shifted. Hundreds of protesters, including Martin Luther King, were arrested. And in September 1961, the ICC, or Interstate Commerce Commission, abolished segregation aboard buses and terminal facilities, including bus stations. Violence erupted in response to these protests. The Ku Klux Klan then dynamited 4 black churches in nearby towns, destroying or heavily damaging them. Now, Birmingham, a major center of iron and steel in the South, was one of the toughest cities in Alabama, and Bull Connor was the ideal white supremacist villain. The SCLC trained hundreds of volunteers in the Civil Rights Boot Camp, teaching them the basics of how to conduct a nonviolent campaign. They were warned that they might face violence and possibly death. Bull Connor had been Commissioner of Public Safety for several decades, off and on. He was notoriously vigilant and cruel. Lewis notes that in Birmingham, segregation was total, and the slightest betrayal of discontent with the racial order was severely, often capitally, punished. Police brutality to blacks was the custom rather than the exception. Of 80,000 registered voters in 1963, only 10,000 were blacks. When desegregation was mandated, they closed the city parks rather than allow blacks to sully them. Whites still sipped water from designated fountains and tried on clothing in fitting rooms for whites only. Blacks were intimidated by the bombing of 17 black churches in 1963. Martin spoke at a packed prayer meeting. "We are heading for Freedom Land, and nothing is going to stop us. We are going to make Birmingham the center of anti-discrimination activity in the nation. I have come here to stay until something is done." Seeing the television cameras roll, Bull Connor's men behaved civilly for 3 days of the demonstrations, anticipating that the local court would issue an injunction forbidding future protests. When this injunction was issued, there was a panic. Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy decided to go to prison as a form of protest, along with 50 other volunteers. Martin was placed in solitary confinement, without access to a phone, without access to his attorney, with all contact cut off. This was the most pressing question. Was Martin Luther King alive, or had he been lynched? On Easter Sunday, his wife, Coretta Scott King, placed a call to the White House, asking if they could inquire into this. The Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, called her and told her, though he was not able to arrange for her husband to call her, that he was indeed safe. And on Monday morning, the President, John F. Kennedy, called her to say that she would be expecting a call from her husband and that FBI agents were on the scene in Birmingham. This controversy prompted 8 white Birmingham pastors, scandalized by the movement's breaking the unjust laws preventing demonstrations, and the militancy of the black leaders and clergy, to issue an appeal for law and order in common sense. In response, Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail, which forcefully contended that blacks had been patient for decades, and that the time is now for positive racial change. What was the message from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail? Every Negro was familiar with the cry of wait. It nearly always meant never. Sensing an impasse, Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy accepted release on bail in late April. When tried a week later, they were fined $50 and 5 days loss of liberty. Now, this was good television, but they needed better television. They launched the most controversial tactic of all. 6,000 children aged 6 to 16 marched and protested from the 16th Street Baptist Church to downtown. 1,000 children were arrested. Up to now, Bull Connor showed restraint for television, but for some reason, he decided to brutalize these children. Lewis recounts the rising violence. 2 fire hoses were dislodged by their water pressure and rocketed into a group of policemen. One officer's ribs and another's legs were crushed. Connor's men were no longer attempting to control the crowds. They had been ordered to drive them brutally into the black sections of the city. It was not surprising that nonviolent discipline collapsed under naked provocation. A hail of rocks, bottles, and brickbats showered the police and the firemen. Lewis notes that later that month, the U.S. Supreme Court decision legalizing sit-in demonstrations in cities enforcing segregation nullified the Alabama laws under which the large majority of Birmingham's demonstrators could be prosecuted. And our author Lewis recounts, on Thursday evening, the white negotiators agreed to the essential demands of the black community. Lunch counters, restrooms, fitting rooms, and drinking fountains in the large downtown stores were to be desegregated. Similarly, the hiring and promotion of black personnel was to take place over the next 60 days, and the nearly 3,000 persons arrested were to be released immediately. But the violence did not cease. Martin's brother's house was demolished by a bomb, although miraculously he, his wife, and his children were not armed. A motel used by SCLC leaders was partially destroyed by a bomb, and the rioting continued. 4 months later, in September 1963, the KKK detonated dynamite under the stairs of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham during Sunday school, killing 4 young black girls, including Eddie Mae, Cynthia, Carol, and Denise, ages 11 to 14, and injuring several dozen others. A white jury eventually convicted several of the perpetrators for murder. John F. Kennedy said this to the American people in his television address. 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves. Yet their heirs, the grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. Next was the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial, heard by 250,000 participants. Before the speeches, they were entertained by many star performers, including Joan Baez, John Dillon, and Peter, Paul, and Mary. We reflected on this short and remarkable speech, which drew from the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation, which ended with the I Have a Dream refrains. They included, I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the contents of their character. Now, a few months later, in November, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in his motorcade in Dallas, Texas. When Lyndon Johnson became president, he used the momentum from the March on Washington and the assassination of John F. Kennedy to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Next was an unsuccessful struggle to battle segregation in the small racist city of St. Augustine, Florida, then the efforts to register black voters and protests for civil rights in Mississippi and in Selma, Alabama. In the Freedom Summer of 1964, many enthusiastic white and a few black college students traveled to Mississippi to assist in voter registration efforts, which was risky because in many small towns, blacks who attempted to register to vote were sometimes lynched. 3 volunteers, 1 black and 2 white Jews, disappeared when returning from registering voters in Mississippi. Their car was found, but they were not. Federal authorities became involved. LBJ ordered Navy divers to search the canals in Mississippi for bodies. They found 1 body, then another, of blacks who had been lynched, but none were the bodies of the 3 students. Finally, an informant came forward to tell them where they had been buried alive with a backhoe. And the full horrifying story is in our Yale lecture notes. Now, tensions mounted as Martin Luther King swooped in from out of town. Martin was encouraging voter registration and was planning a massive nonviolent demonstration in Selma, Alabama. Selma was deeply segregated. Although blacks narrowly outnumbered whites in Selma, Alabama, only 1% of the registered voters were black. Sheriff Jim Clark was the Bull Connor of Selma, firmly determined to preserve white supremacy. The newly elected progressive mayor of Selma, Joseph Smitherman, was supported by white businessmen who sought to attract northern industry by toning down racial issues. And he appointed Wilson Baker as chief of police to undermine the authority of Jim Clark. The SCLC chose to concentrate on Selma to end barriers to voter registration. Hundreds of protesters were carted in police wagons by jail by Sheriff Clark, enraging Chief of Police Baker. But the brutality of Jim Clark, like that of Bull Connor, ensured great television. Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy led a giant demonstration towards the courthouse. They and 1,000 others were arrested in 2 days. As in Birmingham, many of these demonstrators were also schoolchildren. There were many brutal incidents. Police shot several protesters. One died from his wounds. On a Sunday afternoon, 500 disciplined nonviolent marchers attempted to march from their church in Selma to Montgomery to present demands for greater civil rights. Sheriff Jim Clark ordered the marchers to disperse. When they refused, the police attacked. Our biographer Lewis recounts, first there was gas, then the posse on horseback galloped into the swarm of fleeing blacks with cattle prods and flailed their clubs like maniacs. The marchers were driven back across the bridge and into the houses of brave friends. John Lewis, with a fractured skull, and Hosea Williams, led many of the protesters back to the church. At one point, some blacks retaliated, hurling rocks and bricks at the police, even forcing Clark and his men to momentarily retreat. Jim Clark and his men were preparing for more retaliatory violence when Wilson Baker intervened. Diffusing the situation, he persuaded the marchers to retreat into the church and talked Jim Clark into withdrawing his men. Baker likely saved many lives that day. But in Atlanta, Martin was stunned. He promised he would return to Selma on Tuesday to lead another march. On Monday morning, a federal judge issued an injunction forbidding the march. For the first time, Martin prepared to defy a federal injunction. Lewis described this moment in history. The scenario was perfect. Intractable segregation in a small southern city. Courageous black common folk demanding their overdue minimal rights. And police officers whose every sadistic act reified the demonology of the South. In short, this was great television. Many who watched television that night would see images seared into their memory that they would never forget. Lyndon Johnson pleaded with the officials of the SCLC to call off the Tuesday march. Martin Luther King threatened to march to Montgomery. Few of the marchers had prepared for the long march. The marchers crossed the bridge, encountering a line of state troopers, who ordered the marchers to halt. Martin was granted permission for them to kneel and pray. When they stood up, the troopers moved to the shoulders of the road, apparently so they could pass. But then Martin led the marchers back to the church. Meanwhile, President Lyndon Johnson took advantage of the Selma crisis to push through new legislation. President Johnson presented his Voting Rights Act before Congress in prime time on national television. He addressed the American people. I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. At times, history and fate meet at a single time and a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was a century ago at Appomattox, where the Civil War ended, and so it was in Selma, Alabama. Now, the SCLC lawyers petitioned the federal court to allow another march from Selma to finally reach Montgomery. 2 days after Lyndon Johnson's speech, federal Judge Johnson authorized the Selma to Montgomery march, specifically enjoining Sheriff Jim Clark, Governor George Wallace, and other state officials from interfering with it. Judge Johnson's order only allowed 300 to march the distance. 4,000 federal troops and many FBI agents were also dispatched. This final peaceful 5-day march to Montgomery was great television. The actions of white supremacists helped ensure the passage of the Voting Rights Bill. 3 houses were dynamited and several bombs of the mayor's house were disabled. Most tragic was the death of a white Detroit mother and housewife who had volunteered to drive protesters home to Selma from Montgomery. As she was driving to Selma, white thugs drove up beside her and shot her in the head, killing her. Our biographer Lewis lists the main issue that Martin Luther King and the SCLC were considering as they expanded the civil rights campaigns to include northern cities. The growing conviction among whites that the blacks with federal backing were moving too rapidly. The fierce objections by black militants that racial progress had not only been too slow, but was being subtly manipulated by powerful whites. Practical programs to deal with urban and northern black poverty, and whether the military spending on the war in Vietnam was hampering funding for civil rights programs. And the problem was, though, combating urban black poverty was the more important battle. These were not simple battles. They did not make for good television like the dramatic protests in places like Birmingham and Selma, where there were snarling dogs and fire hoses, and villainous southern state troopers with clubs and ominous sunglasses. Now, what was unique about the large northern cities were the multi-story substandard housing projects that dwarfed anything in the South. In addition to protesting for civil rights, Martin Luther King felt compelled to join the protests over the unpopular Vietnam War. But the SCLC at first voted that Martin could only publicly express his opposition to the war as a private citizen, not as an officer representing the SCLC. Martin's opposition to the war muddled his civil rights message and distracted from his efforts. 2 weeks later, rioting and looting erupted in Harlem, where white merchants and police were assaulted. LBJ immediately conferred with the leading civil rights activists. Chief among them was Martin Luther King, who traveled to New York City, where black leaders issued a statement condemning the rioting, asking that demonstrations be suspended until after the November election. And this was followed by large-scale rioting in Los Angeles, California. The administration had passed a $1 billion program to fight poverty, but these sums barely touched the problem of pervasive poverty. Lewis notes, of Chicago's 3.5 million people in 1964, nearly 1 million are black, and almost half of them are impoverished. Of those who are not many are well above the poverty line, and the overwhelming majority are concentrated in the appalling residential slums on the city's south and west sides. Martin rented an apartment in Chicago to publicize the substandard housing, but his wife Coretta couldn't stand the smell of urine. But Chicago did differ from southern states in that the boss of Chicago, Richard Daley, was not a white supremacist, and was not only willing to confer with the civil rights leaders, but also tried to steal their thunder with pronouncements of new city programs to diffuse whatever protests they planned. Chicago was not good television. Meanwhile, in Memphis, 2 black garbage crewmen were crushed to death when the automatic compressor of their truck was accidentally triggered. And angry workers in Memphis voted to strike in February. Meanwhile, sanitation workers in New York City also went on strike for wage increases and additional benefits. Walter Reuther of the AFL-CIO offered material assistance to their Memphis local, but Memphis Mayor Loeb, whose election had been opposed by 80% of black voters, refused both to recognize the union and refused to sign a written contract to end the strike. And this is a picture of one of the Wiener barrel trucks which killed these 2 sanitation workers. This was a simpler contest, more suited to the confrontational, nonviolent protests that Martin Luther King and the SCLC preferred. Many blacks welcomed his swooping down to assist in Memphis, but that didn't include many of the young militant blacks in Memphis. There, the youth organization Invaders declared, "If you expect honkies to get the message, you gotta break some windows." Then the nation was stunned when Lyndon Johnson announced that he did not plan to run for re-election as president. But this also meant that now he had a freer hand in pursuing civil rights legislation. A nonviolent protest was planned in Memphis. Over 6,000 nonviolent protesters began the peaceful march. But when they heard the sound of glass breaking, Martin and the nonviolent protesters retreated back to the church or went home. The militant protesters continued in what was now a riot. In the melee, the police shot a teenage black. 50 people were injured and over 100 were arrested, though property damage was largely limited to broken windows and the looting of window display cases. Martin Luther King announced immediately that another march, far better organized, was planned for that Friday. He persuaded the invaders to participate in a non-violent protest. But a federal court issued an injunction against further demonstrations, backed up by a Justice Department attorney. Martin Luther King did not defy the federal injunction forbidding further Memphis demonstrations planned for Friday. On Thursday evening, Martin was standing on the balcony of his Memphis motel with Ralph Abernathy and other associates. And across the street, James Earl Ray carefully pulled the trigger of his Remington rifle. What was the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King? While he was publicizing the economic and housing plight of the Negro, President Lyndon Johnson was shepherding further civil rights legislation through Congress. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was signed by Lyndon Johnson on April 11th. Included in that legislation was the Fair Housing Act that forbade racial or any other forms of discrimination when dwellings are rented or sold. Hate crimes were addressed and federal protections for voting, schooling, and employment were strengthened. This legislation did address some of the issues Martin Luther King had publicized in his protests in Chicago. But massive riots in more than a dozen cities erupted after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and some of these riots persisted for years off and on. In her biography on LBJ, Kearns writes that after Lyndon Johnson canvassed the opinion in Congress, he was convinced that the riots had destroyed whatever sense of injustice, compassion, or guilt King's death had produced, that the country was in no mood for progressive words on race. That November, the Republican Richard Nixon won an overwhelming landslide victory in the 1968 presidential election. But Democrats retained a healthy margin in both the House and the Senate, though many Southern Democratic congressmen were not enthusiastic supporters of civil rights. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. The author, David Levering Lewis, was planning to write the biography of Martin Luther King when he was assassinated. It was initially published 16 months later and quickly became the classic biography of this civil rights icon. Likewise, Doris Kearns' Lyndon Johnson, The American Dream, is part autobiography, since a major source were her notes of his extensive comments while she was a guest at his Texas ranch. We discussed these biographies in greater depth in our reflections on Martin's youth and school years and our reflection on his closing years. We are planning reflections on Doris Kearns' biography of LBJ and how he was able to shepherd effective civil rights legislation through Congress. And Doris Kearns will release in April an unfinished love story from her and her late husband's notes on the momentous 60s, including the Great Society programs and the Vietnam War. And we are also planning reflections on Thurgood Marshall, who is a future Supreme Court Justice, and his legal attacks on segregation, voting rights, and discrimination as lead counsel of the NAACP, whose litigation led to the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision, which enabled Martin Luther King to fight for civil rights. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.